I'm Gary Anthony Ramsey with your Our News Now Rewind. Stories making headlines for the week ending January 29, 2010. Our top stories include 43 million people watched Barack Obama give his State of the Union address. The Congressional Budget Office reports the U.S. deficit will hit $1.5 trillion. Missouri tops the nation's African-American homicide rate list. The woman who raised the child that was kidnapped 23 years ago is arrested. Egypt is the latest African nation exploding with political unrest, and Oprah Winfrey drops a decades-old family secret on her television show. Our top story: Barack Obama gives his State of the Union address before a unified House with Republicans and Democrats sitting side by side. But the seating arrangements didn't prevent either side from having different takes on what they heard. The president called this America's Sputnik moment. With America facing continuing economic crisis, he said that we could win the future if we work together. He touched on unemployment, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the ongoing battle over health care reform.
So I say to this chamber tonight, instead of refighting the battles of the last 2 years, let's fix what needs fixing and let's move forward.
The president proposed a 5-year freeze on domestic spending to help deal with the blooming deficit. But he also talked about programs that he said would help America invest in the future. Republicans say that language is code for spending.
The facts are clear. Since taking office, President Obama has signed into law spending increases of nearly 25% for domestic government agencies, an 84% increase when you include the failed stimulus. All of this new government spending was sold as investment. Yet after 2 years, the unemployment rate remains above 9%, and government has added over $3 trillion to our debt.
More than 43 million Americans watched the speech, and a poll finds that most people liked what they heard. The USA Today Gallup poll says that 65% of those who watched the speech had a favorable reaction, with 28% having a negative one. Well, the Congressional Budget Office issued a report that might put a damper on those high numbers. The CBO says that the deficit for this year will run to $1.5 trillion, the highest it's ever been. The director of the CBO points to the rising cost of Medicare and other health programs as the driving force behind the rising debt. However, the CBO director still insists that repealing the new health care law would only add to the deficit by $250 billion. Well, unemployment also took a jump last month, with more than 454,000 Americans filing for unemployment. Analysts point to the harsh weather across the country, which has forced many companies in the South and Midwest to close operations. Alabama, Georgia, North and South Carolina reported the highest job losses. Overall, more than 9.5 million Americans are collecting unemployment benefits. In Missouri, a nationwide crime study puts the Show Me State on the top of the list for the homicide rate for African Americans. The study from the Violence Policy Center used FBI data from 2008. It found that there were 287 African American homicide victims that year. The study found that the black homicide rate is 39.9 per 100,000 people. Pennsylvania, which topped the list the last 2 years, is second with a rate of 31.05 per 100,000. This is the second time in 5 years that Missouri has led in the African American homicide rate. In New York, a woman is being held without bail as she faces charges in the abduction of a baby 23 years ago from Harlem Hospital. Ann Petway is the woman who raised Carlina White. Initial reports have said that she has confessed to the kidnapping. White, who went through life with many different names, was only 19 days old when she was snatched. As an adult, White launched her own investigation and discovered that she was in fact a kidnapping victim. She reunited with her parents just last week. Petway, who's 49 years old, now faces life in prison if she's convicted of kidnapping. In Ohio, an Akron woman who lives in a black neighborhood was convicted of lying so that she could send her children to a predominantly white school district. Kelly Williams-Ballar has since been released from jail after serving her 9-day sentence. The 40-year-old was convicted by a jury of using her father's address to claim residency status that would allow her children to attend a higher-performing suburban school. While her sentence was light in terms of jail time, Williams-Ballar was put on probation for 2 years and ordered to complete 80 hours of community service. The felony conviction may threaten her ability to get the teaching license she was working on. In your Our News Now World Wrap, the Egyptian government's control over its country remains tenuous as people continue to riot in the street, saying they are frustrated with rising prices and the general policies of President Hosni Mubarak. Tens of thousands of protesters have taken to the streets in the last week. The clashes with Egyptian police have been deadly, with confrontations leaving both protesters and officers dead. Demonstrators are demanding more democratic freedoms in the country. The Egyptian protests come just days after demonstrations and unrest in Tunisia forced that country's president to flee his country. In Uganda, a gay rights activist is murdered, and now some wonder how will his killer be found in a country that is considering legislation that would make homosexuality a crime. David Kato was found bludgeoned in his home just weeks after he and other human rights activists won a victory against a newspaper that suggested that all gays and lesbians in Uganda be killed. Currently, in the Ugandan parliament, there is a measure that would have homosexuals jailed for life. After a week of speculation and anxiety in South Africa, Nelson Mandela has been released from the hospital and has been given a clean bill of health. The 92-year-old Mandela was admitted to undergo tests on his respiratory system, but the week of silence by the African government had many people wondering if Mandela was in fact dying. Thousands gathered at the hospital and at his home. But Mr. Mandela was released from the hospital with the health minister of that country giving Mr. Mandela a clean bill of health.
At this stage, the medical panel is satisfied with his recovery and he will be discharged to receive home-based care at his home.
Mandela became South Africa's first black president after spending 27 years in prison for protesting against the country's old apartheid policy. That's your World Wrap. In pop culture news, the man who went from being homeless to being sought after by the networks has left rehab against the advice of his doctors. Ted Williams, whose so-called golden voice was discovered after a story about him on YouTube, had agreed to go to Drug and Alcohol Treatment Center in Texas after an appearance on the Dr. Phil show. Williams, who has received a number of job offers since his internet explosion, has returned to Los Angeles to join his girlfriend, who is still in drug and alcohol treatment at a center in California. Oprah Winfrey drops a huge family secret on TV, and now that secret is the target of the tabloids. The queen of TV talk revealed that she has a younger sister. The Milwaukee woman, who's only been identified so far as Patricia, says that she's known for years that she had a famous sister. Winfrey said she was stunned to learn about the sibling, telling her audience that when Patricia was born in 1963, Winfrey was 8 years old and living with her father, and she didn't even know that her mother was pregnant. For a complete look at any of the stories you've seen on The Rewind, remember, as always, go to the bottom of the web page, find the link of the story you'd like to see, and click your way through. That's your Our News Now Rewind for this week. I'm Gary Anthony Ramsey.